It gives me enormous pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker. I suspect that to most of you in this room, she doesn't really need an introduction, but formalities must be adhered to, and it's actually a very pleasing formality in this case, because the match between speaker and subject in this case is about as perfect as you could imagine. This is a speaker who's more or less invented the subject whereof she will be speaking today. So Bina Agarwal is Professor of Development Economics and Environment at the University of Manchester in England. This is a relatively recent incarnation. Until last year, about this time, she was Director of the Institute of Economic Growth at Delhi University. Right now, she's president of a society that she has also been very instrumental in building up. It's the International Society for Ecological Economics. And she has deep and long-standing connections to Harvard, where she was the first Daniel Ingalls visiting professor. That has special meaning for me because when I was much, much younger, I took Vedic Sanskrit with Daniel Ingalls, so there's a continuity of threads and connections here. And later she was also a research fellow at the Ash Institute at the Kennedy School, so it's particularly a pleasure to welcome her back into our Harvard surroundings. Bina has held important positions in virtually every institution that's connected to development economics, the International Economic Association, where she's been vice president, the International Association for Feminist Economics, where, of course, she has been president. She's on the board of the Global Development Network. She served on the UN Committee for Development Policy and is a member of the editorial boards of many international academic journals in her field. Her research is unusual in combining both theoretical and empirical dimensions, and you'll see some of that played out here. She's been extraordinarily prolific, with something on the order of 9 books and dozens of articles to her credit. But there's a focal point or a thread that connects a lot of this work. She's the person who's done more than anyone I know to place the issue of women's land rights both on public policy agendas and on the agenda of economic scholarship as a whole, and not content with a kind of effervescent academic career that throws out sparks in every possible direction. She's also been politically active. She was one of the people who catalyzed a campaign for the comprehensive amendment of Hindu inheritance law in India to make it gender equal in 2005. The best known of her many well-known works, at least up to today's discussion, in part based on this more recent book. The previous best-known book was A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1994. It won the Kumaraswamy Book Prize, the Edgar Graham Book Prize, and the K.H. Bateja Award, all in 1996. She's also received all kinds of recognitions for her work more generally in the area of development economics, and the ones I will mention are that in 2008, she received a Padma Shri Award from the President of India for her contributions to education, and in 2010, the Leontief Prize from Tufts University here in our own neighborhood for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Her latest book is Gender and Green Governance, this one, and in it she explores the paradoxical title or subtitle of what she's going to talk to us about today, namely, If Women Governed Forests, A History of Absence, the Impact of Presence. So let me turn the floor over to Bina for her presentation.
Sheila, thank you very much for that really very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to have Sheila introduce you. I've had many different conversations and learned a great deal from Sheila's own work and our conversations, and I hope today as well from all of you. Should we just dip the light a little bit? I hope we're trying to do a balance between my being able to read my notes and you being able to see the slides. So this is a sort of, it's in between, it's a little bit in between a book talk and a South Asia Beyond Borders talk. Empirically, for instance, in my book, Gender and Green Governance, I cover not just India, but India and Nepal, but conceptually, I hope some of the issues I raise has relevance beyond, and in terms of research methodology as well, have relevance beyond the empirical context. Since this is the year of the Hobbit, let me begin by evoking The Lord of the Rings. Now, those of you who've read Tolkien's book will agree that it has many remarkable layers. In a wonderful flight of poetic imagination, Tolkien, in part 2 of The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, leads us into a primeval forest in Middle-earth, inhabited by tree-like creatures, the Great Ents. Now, when the hobbits, Pippin and Merry, ask their help from against the dark forces, Treebeard, who's the oldest Ent, convenes an Entmoot. This is the equivalent of a forest council. And he explains the purpose of the meeting not only to those who turn up, but also to those who could not come. So this is what he says. I have still got to explain things to those who live a long way off, and after that we have to decide what to do. It is no use denying we shall be here a long time yet, a couple of days, very likely. So what an immensely democratic and inclusive form of decision-making. And yet something is missing. There are no women, none in the council, none in the forest. The Ent trees in the Entmoot are all male. And in the lush forest, there are no women searching for firewood or fodder or medicinal herbs or wild vegetables. All the things that we know it is in women's domain to collect. Tolkien, in a deft flick of storytelling, tells us that the Ent wives, the female Ents, who had kept order and peace and had cultivated gardens, have long disappeared. In other words, women and their work have been made invisible. Moreover, there is no hint that Ent wives were ever invited to an Entmoot. Now, this story, in a way, perfectly captures the essence of a term that I had coined in 2001, which I called participatory exclusions, which is exclusions of significant sections from seemingly participative institutions. In this case, the exclusion of women from forest governance. We actually need a giant leap forward from Ent time and the sharp eye of economic historian. Some of you might know the work of Jane Humphreys. And she's talked about the context of what women collected in Middle England. And she describes how those forests were used in late 18th and 19th centuries when they were commonwealth. So she notes that women were the principal gatherers of fuel. In Cornwall, they cut furze in early summer from thickets up to 10 feet high. And in Surrey, they brought home prodigious loads of wood from the forest, bent nearly double. Here's a picture I found of this. And she also describes women gathering watercress, rabbits, pigeons, raspberries, hazelnuts, and so on. Now, we know that in late 18th and early 19th centuries, the enclosure movement converted this commonwealth into private wealth, and so deprived peasant women of independent access to items of daily needs. Many women protested the enclosures. And this is really hidden nuggets in the history of environment of that time. But they had very little influence in shaping the decisions. Today, what we see is therefore a duality: women's central stake and knowledge of forests, and their often near absence from bodies that control forest use. And this is a common feature across the globe. We see it in the Amazon, we see it in Africa, and especially in South Asia. So what I will do is I will very briefly trace the history of South Asian women's absence from traditional institutions of forest governance, and then examine the impact of their presence. Now, what's interesting I found when I started working on this is that historians of South Asia have paid rather little attention to women in governance, any form of governance, except for a focus on their struggle for the right to vote and to stand for elections in the early 20th century. South Asian environmental history tells us even less about gender and governance. So, what you find is that people describe ungendered entities subsumed within general categories like villagers and tribals, even when the context makes it very clear that there is a gender to the subject. So, for instance, there is a well-known environmental historian who talks of the effect of the 1965 Forest Act in India, and he says this will bring great hardship to villagers gathering firewood, thatch grass, fodder, etc. But clearly it is not all villagers, but particularly women, because they are the ones who faced the most hardship, because they are the ones who gather these items. So this is a classic example of conflating gendered subjects into general ones. So what do we do if we want to infer women's place historically in local environmental governance? So basically what I did was gleaned through hundreds of ethnographies and colonial accounts, and these indicated that local governance was neither participative in scope, nor was it democratic in conception. Typically, village affairs, including allocating rights to the commons, was done by a hereditary headman on behalf of village councils. And women were usually excluded from the councils, often even when the dispute concerned themselves, they were represented by a male relative. And although they used forest extensively, they had little voice in governing them, not unlike Tolkien's Middle-earth. Against this background, the move to include women in public bodies in South Asia can only be termed dramatic. And as I see it, there are three main trajectories to this move. The first was led by the idea that women should participate in public decision-making, and this took root in the early 20th century in the context of India's anti-colonial struggle, in which we know that large numbers of women participated. There was lobbying by women's organizations for a place in the emerging democratic institutions. And this culminated in the right to vote and to contest elections. The second trajectory, this is a very broad brush. I'm going through large areas of history and contestation in a moment. The second trajectory stemmed from the idea of decentralized government in post-colonial India. Including women was seen as necessary for building an effective democracy. And they argued that we should have at least 2 women, because they said, well, 1 woman will feel lonely. So in but of course that changed in the 19s. So in 1993, the Indian Constitution was amended, as we know, and there was reservation for 1/3 for women in local government. The third trajectory was the 1990s, and this was the push for decentralized control over forests. There are some chairs there if people want to come. Now, as many of you know, 96% of forests in India and Nepal are government-owned. So the devolution of control over forest management to communities was a necessary, but it was not a sufficient condition for including women in governance. It was just one step. So very briefly, if I elaborate, in the 1970s, satellite images revealed that forests were disappearing rapidly with the spread of agriculture, railways, large irrigation dams, and so on, and urban spread. Now, to stem this decline and to revive forests, governments in many countries of Asia and Africa, they initiated tree planting, and it was called social forestry programs. But as I had argued in a very early book, 1986, called Cold Hearts and Barren Slopes, social forestry was promoted in a top-down manner. It was mainly commercial trees, species such as eucalyptus, which were planted. And there was very little discussion with villagers on what kinds of trees they wanted. So very few trees that were planted on community land actually survived. In some cases, some evaluation showed only 2% of them survived. So indeed, in fact, social forestry was neither social nor was forestry in terms of the type of trees. Now, state failure in protecting forests led to a global debate, the property rights debate, on the question, what would be the most appropriate institutional arrangement for forest conservation. And I remember this being argued in the Kennedy School as well, where of course there were some arguments took it for granted that of course communities can never cooperate. So if there's state failure, then we must privatize. In fact, what was happening, if you actually looked on the ground, was that there were emerging stories of successful forest protection by communities through self-initiated groups. There were forest movements, and these were clearly an alternative. So by the late 1980s, there was growing consensus globally, at least among the policy circles, in favor of communities managing forests. And over 50 countries, therefore, decided to experiment with some form of co-management. India was among the first to make this shift. It launched what was called the Joint Forest Management Program in 1990, in which what was happening was that the villagers and the government would share co-responsibility and would share the benefits. So villagers could protect, they could extract according to certain rules that they made from the forest, and then if there was timber, etc., that was growing, then it had to be negotiated in terms of what proportion would be shared. And Nepal in 1993 followed suit with its own version of community forestry. So by the early 2000s, India had an estimated 84,000 such groups involving 8.4 million rural families, protecting 22.4% of India's degraded forest area. Nepal had 10,000 such groups, covering 1 million households and 11% of forest land. I'll call these groups CFIs for short, community forestry institutions. Now, women were to be included in CFIs, but in limited degree. So, for instance, most Indian states prescribe that you should have at least 2 women. You know, this old order of 1 woman will feel lonely, let's have 2. So some later scaled this up to include 1/3 women, but this was treated actually as a maximum rather than as a minimum. In practice, most CFIs did not follow even the minimum prescription. And where women were included, you found that because of social norms, etc., they had very little effective participation. So you might ask, well, what does inclusion really mean? Basically, CFIs have a 2-tier governance structure. You have a general body in which all villagers can be members. The term all villagers could vary by state. Sometimes it meant 1 person per household, sometimes it mostly, and sometimes it meant, at the other extreme, all adults. Typically 1 person per household, which was typically of the male head of household. And then there was an executive committee of 9 to 15 members. And both these bodies interactively made the rules for forest use, the punishment for abuse, the forms of protection, benefit distribution, and for conflict resolution. And so the EC, the Executive Committee, was the core decision-making body, not unlike many other institutions we know. So who has voice in the EC thus clearly has a bearing on how well the CFIs function and who gains and loses from them. But having a voice means beyond token membership. So what is having a voice? You know, this is a typology which some of you might actually have seen in one of my papers, the participatory exclusion paper, that you can have simply nominal participation being a member of a group, which is the least. And then you can have various degrees of passive participation. You attend a meeting, you listen to what's happening, maybe you are consulted, and then you can participate in activities. So you can move from there to what I call empowered participation, which is being able to move to influence decisions. And we'd recognize that this sort of typology could be created in many cases, including in university committees. Typically, women were not even nominal members of. Now, usually you found that typically women were not even nominal members because, as I said, that if you had 1 person per household rule, then you had typically the male head of household. Even when 2 women were recommended, or 1/3, these were treated as a maximum. Typically, women's presence was therefore low. Some groups had no women, some had 1 or 2 women, and some had a few more women in a group of 11 to 15 executive committee members. Overlaying on that, There are traditional social norms in South Asia, so many did not attend meetings. If they attend, they won't speak up, or if they express opinions, those opinions are not taken seriously. So these participatory exclusions were widespread. Here's a picture. Can you spot the women? This is a quote from what they said. So basically, women in institutions, of forest governance, what you find is you have two opposing forces. One seeks to correct a historic disadvantage by prescribing that women should be included, and the other perpetuates that disadvantage through social norms that restrict effective participation. But there were exceptions. We do find mixed gender groups with 30 to 40% women or even all women. And I explored this, well, why is it the case? And I found that there were a lot of non-systematic factors underlying their emergence. Some were historic, some were demographic, ecological. We can talk about it in the discussion. Now, having more women in the EC makes an important difference to effective participation. For instance, based on my econometric analysis in the book, at a seminar I presented earlier, a year ago or 2 years ago at the Kennedy School, I shared the results to show that critical mass lay between 25 to 33% women. And especially if the women were landless, they tended to be more effective at the lower end of the scale. So natural question is, would women's greater participation in the decision-making of these bodies affect institutional outcomes? So this brings me to the third and substantial part of my talk, which is the impact of presence. Now, typically what you find is that economists who have studied environmental collective action and green governance have paid rather little attention to gender, whether it's a question of women's absence or their presence. But interestingly, research done by non-economists on gender and green governance has focused mainly on women's absence and the cultural and other factors which underlie that absence. So neither body of work I found when I began working on this asked the question, well, what impact would women's presence have in these institutions? Would their inclusion, which is undeniably important for equity, also affect decisions for forest use and outcomes? For instance, outcomes for conservation. Would it lead to better forests? Would it matter what class women belong to? How many women would make a difference? Now, answers to these questions can prove foundational for effective environmental governance and policy. Because as we know, forests provide not just biodiversity, they also serve as carbon sinks, and they fulfill people's everyday needs. Yet I found that there was virtually no empirical focus on these questions. And therefore, I made this the central focus of this book of mine, Gender and Green Governance. And I looked the empirical core of the book. I mean, there's 11 chapters. There's 3 conceptual and historical chapters for a start. There are 6 empirical chapters and 2 policy. So 11 chapters. The empirical part, I look at whether the gender composition of the executive committee makes a difference to a range of factors, issues like effective participation, the rules of forest use, rule violations, forest conservation, and firewood fodder shortages. The last one is a proxy, if you like, for gender equity outcomes. Today, I'm going to focus on only one element of this, which is the forest conservation aspect. Now, before I do that, we might want to consider, for those who are skeptics on this, why would we expect women's presence to make a difference and have an impact? Now, there are several reasons why this might be the case. But most importantly, rural women's dependence on forests is different from, it's greater than, and it's more everyday than men's. Now, this creates gender differences in the stake that men and women have on forest conservation, in their ability to conserve, and in their knowledge of plants and species. So for instance, women and men depend on forests and local commons for different items because of the gender division of labor. Women tend to collect firewood, fodder, non-timber products, And 65% of rural households in India, even today, and as much as 90% in Nepal, use firewood for cooking. And this is mostly gathered and not purchased by gathered by women and children. They also gather food items. I'll come back to this. These are just some pictures of various things that they gather. In contrast, men in subsistence context depend on forests mainly for timber and for house repairs or tools, and timber can also be purchased. Most importantly, women's dependence is everyday, men's dependence is occasional. Secondly, the extent of women's dependence on forests and local commons is greater because they have less access to private property resources, such as land and earnings. And such dependence is higher, of course, if you're poor and you're landless. Now, these gender and class differences in forest dependence means that women are much more, I won't have time to explore this in any depth today, but women are much more adversely affected when forests and commons decline. Now, they can decline, they can degrade, either because they disappear or people cut down trees for various reasons. And there are various sorts of implications. There are implications for their incomes, for nutrition, for health, and so on. Importantly, though, differences in forest use also create differences in knowledge of ecosystems. So if you're collecting, for instance, grasses, then you'll have a knowledge of different types of grasses, where they grow, etc., how should you gather them. So the knowledge of ecosystems is therefore gendered. Men collect different things, women collect different things at different distances. Marty's done some work on that, as I remember, a long time ago. And so they tend to know, these differences in knowledge therefore have different bearings on what you bring to bear when you're trying to conserve a natural resource, and also on biodiversity. Also, since forest products have different gestation periods, firewood generates more quickly than timber, there are gender differences in the pressure to extract and the impact of extraction. And of course, as you know, economists tend to want to value everything, and there is a lot of contingent valuation exercises that are done. And one might therefore say that the valuation exercises would have different results depending on whether the respondent is a man or a woman. But most importantly, the interests that men and women might have, the interests and preferences could differ. Now, all this would also mean that the degree, Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate who wrote on governing the commons hugely, had a set of design principles, but she didn't gender her analysis. Now, if you did apply those design principles, like you have to have communities must participate in rule making, they must participate in conflict resolution, and if you just simply take those design principles and gender them, you would see that you would expect institutions not to sustain if they didn't involve women, even if she didn't actually gender those principles. But having said this, I also want to say that we must be cautious about linear narratives that characterize a lot of the gender and environment literature. Because linear narratives assume without verification that if you simply include women, all good things will follow. And so, is that the case? Well, not automatically. Because women's relationship with forests is complex. Precisely because there is an everyday dependence and a substantial dependence, they would want to extract more. So on the one hand, they would have a greater stake in forest conservation. On the other hand, they would want to extract. So as one landless woman told me, of course it hurts me to cut a green branch, but what would I do if my children go hungry? In other words, women face conflicting choices between immediate subsistence and long-term conservation. And the impact of their presence on conservation could therefore go either way. We cannot automatically assume that their inclusion, which is no doubt very good for equity, will necessarily be good for conservation. So I started out with a fairly agnostic position and said, let's try and measure this and see what results we get. But in doing so, of course, we have to control for a whole range of other factors. And there was no data set available to do this, so I had to collect my own data. I chose 2 sites India and Nepal, both of which had community forestry introduced in 1993, in the 1990s, early 1990s. My data relates to 135 CFIs, of which 65 are drawn from 3 districts of Gujarat in western India and 70 from 3 districts of Nepal. And what I did was choose them on the basis of the executive committee. I chose my sample. In the case of Gujarat, it was a stratified random sample, dividing the groups into those which had 2 women and less, to those with more than 2 women, because that was the sort of guideline. And in the case of Nepal, I found there were also a lot of all-women groups. So I had a 3-stage stratified random sample for Nepal. Now, fieldwork was difficult. It was the height of the Maoist insurgency in Nepal. But nevertheless, we did a lot of focus group discussions. We talked to forest committees, to groups of male and female villagers, to key individuals. We recorded environmental histories. We assessed the forests. I developed an index to actually give one of the indices for how do you measure a change in a forest. We looked at records of meetings, we made maps, we looked at satellite data, and overall there were 9 types of questionnaires and all of this. Now, in terms of forest profiles, I just want to mention that Gujarat's forests were extremely degraded when they were handed over to rural communities. So that, if you look at descriptions of those forests early on, you'll find that said if you took a broom and you swept, you won't get a few leaves even. Often the rootstock was not there. Sometimes the rootstock was there. In the case of Nepal, more biodiverse forests were handed over in the Middle Hills. Now, one feature which was very striking was that when you looked at all women's groups and groups with men, in the case of Nepal, you found that there was a very significant difference in the kind of forest that they were given. As you can see here, all women's groups had half the size, small forests, much more degraded, much younger, much less canopy cover. So they started out with an initial disadvantage. And the reason was that the forest official said, well, women don't know how to, women have no experience in this, so we need to test them. They don't know the rules, nobody will listen to their decisions. So the question is, does the actual performance go along with this kind of skepticism? So what does forest protection mean? I mean, suppose all of us were given a forest, how would we protect it? And what it means is that you start off by saying, well, we are going to allow, and we are going to restrict entry. We're not going to allow you to collect everything that you collected. We're not going to allow your children to come in, your goats and cattle and everybody to come in. We're not going to allow you all to come in at any time you want. Actually, forest protection rules can vary from complete ban on entry to restricted extraction of certain products at certain times of the year. And it's quite amazing how inventive villagers are. So if you take 10 villages in a row in one district, they'll come up with 10 sets of rules on whether to extract and what to extract and how much to extract. So there's constant negotiation, and these are results of ecology and negotiation. And the data I had, we collected for every single forest item that was collected and what were the rules for that collection. How do you protect? So you can either have a guard and everybody contributes some money to the payment for the guard to go around, or you can have a patrol group, which means say 3 households or 4 households say we're going to go for a week and the next set and so on and so forth, or you can have a mix of the two. And this can make a difference. Now, there were what sorts of, apart from what we want to know is, okay, we protect a forest, does it make a difference if there are women making as a party to the decision in the executive committee? Now, what kinds of factors must we control for in addition to gender? First, gender. So we looked at 4 sorts of factors. I looked at the executive committee characteristics, the characteristics of the institution, of the forest, and of the village and its location. The characteristics of the EC are of prime importance to us. So, for instance, why would we expect groups which have more women to perform better? One is that we would expect it to improve protection because you have half the population which is using the forest intensively. If you involve them, we would expect that protection would be better. Secondly, as I said, they have ecological knowledge. And so again, if half the population has certain types of knowledge in what to extract, how to extract, etc., if you involve them, then we would expect that that would make a difference. Now, so both those factors, but then I also looked at whether the age of the woman made a difference. Does she have more authority? Elderly women have more authority. Do they have more knowledge? And so on. And in order to test the gender effects, we control for these other variables. I won't spend too much time on this. But then you'll say, well, what is forest conservation? I mean, it's such a complicated thing, if you like. And the way I looked at it was improvement in canopy cover and regeneration. But how do you actually measure that? Villagers will have one view of it, so you talk to the villagers. The research team will have another view of it. The forest department will have another view of it. Then you can have satellite sources. So very difficult to get, but for Gujarat managed to get that. So you have, say in 1991 and 2001, you calibrate a canopy, the cover change to the village forest. And so used all of these, we ended up with 4 variables for forest improvement for Gujarat and 2 for Nepal. And I can answer questions on this if necessary. Now, Now, overall, what you find is that in the majority of cases, this is one of those pictures which I managed to get through an NGO. It's in Gujarat, and the top one was when they started protecting. And in the bottom one was after 5 years of protection. This is, if the rootstock is intact, it's a teak area. So in 5 years, you actually can get a young teak forest if you don't allow, if you restrict entry of human and animals. I must admit, they are taken in different seasons. So, but nevertheless, having said that, this part, that top part, as you can see, it's still very degraded. And if you didn't protect it, without protection in that 5 years before, wouldn't look like this. So there has been substantial regeneration. But the question is this better if we have more women in the executive committee? Now, so let me just quickly share my regression results. I had no idea whether I would get these results. So I was actually very pleased that I did. And you do find that women's presence makes a significant positive difference to forest condition. Now, this was so if you compared, in the case of Gujarat, the groups with 2 women and less with those with more than 2 women. Those with more than 2 women had significantly better outcomes on the basis of most of the indicators that I had outlined. In the case of Nepal, it was even more dramatic. If you compared all women groups with men, there was a 51% greater probability of improving forest canopy, despite, as you remember, they got poorer, smaller, younger, less biodiverse forests. And for those who are interested in regressions, I won't bore you with them. This result is up there, which is the marginal effect of a logit analysis of 51, which is 51% greater probability, controlling for a range of other factors. As you can see, other factors also matter. The average age, older members makes a difference. In the case of Nepal, larger numbers of Brahmins in the committee has a positive effect, partly because they don't withdraw very much from the forest. And if you have forest canopy, if you have better canopy at the time of handover, the likelihood of improvement is greater. So therefore, the results that despite poorer canopy, women's groups did better is even more remarkable. Now I want to share with you, in addition to this, one more result, which is of one district in Gujarat. There were 3 districts I selected. Now in this district in Gujarat, there were 2 features which were special. One was that not only in the groups which had a larger proportion of women, those women were typically landless. So there was a disproportionate representation of landless women. Secondly, that in this district, the presence of women, groups with more women, made less strict rules. They extracted more. Now, typically you would expect that if we're extracting a lot from a forest, it will have worse conservation outcomes. In fact, what you find is that it is not the case. You find that by all the indicators, that in this district Panchmahal, despite less strict rules, you have the groups with more women do substantially better on conservation, which means there is no conflict between greater equity and greater efficiency. So why do groups with more women perform better? Well, one is that there's greater compliance of the rules if you include women, and they say that. We feel the forest is ours. When I was only a CFI member, I used to steal grass from the forest. After becoming an EC member, I stopped stealing. There's more information on sharing of the rules. So they induct more women, they share the rules. For instance, in this case, they held a meeting and they persuaded women from the next village not to come. And here is a forest patrol group, one of the groups. And this is what they said. Okay. There are other factors also which matter. Groups, women's greater knowledge, their preferences are given greater attention if they're members of the EC. And the solidarity part is not something I could actually measure, but you have a lot of experimental games literature which indicates, including at Harvard, the journal Negotiation, which brings out, it has a lot of studies which show that groups which have a larger proportion of women tend to have better conflict resolution. Okay, so let me then conclude with some policy pointers. We began with the history of women's absence and we ended with the impact of presence. In terms of impact, we had several positive outcomes. For instance, women's greater presence can significantly improve conservation and regeneration. Secondly, conservation would be enhanced further if there were more landless and poor women on the EC. And this is interesting because a lot of the feminist philosophers have argued that if you're poor, you're at the bottom of the pyramid, you're not going to be able to speak up in meetings. You find quite the opposite, that if you're poor and female, it does not place you at the bottom of the pyramid because they're less restricted by social norms. And so if they speak up, there's much to gain. They have less to lose in terms of social status and much to gain in terms of the outcomes, if the outcomes are in their favor. Now, then the question is, of course, how do you increase women's numbers? And here I talk about what I call a web of strategic alliances, that here's one way to link up. Now, we all know that federations are common from self-help groups. Many of you would know about federations. And what I'm suggesting here is community forestry groups linking up with self-help groups. It's like in a parliament, you have women's caucuses who strategize outside and then influence decisions. So if you have self-help groups who also have a stake locally in forests and local resources, and they link up horizontally. Now, self-help groups have federations, but those federations could be built on for community forestry groups as well to give this sort of structure. And here is an example of an actual federation. Nepal is unique in the world. It has the entire country forest user groups federation. It's called FECOFUN. 14,000 groups are linked to it. And when its constitution was framed, it was written in the constitution that 50% of office bearers and members would be women. Now, of course, in practice, there is a gap, obviously, between what is written down in a constitution and how it's implemented. But nevertheless, this is a very good example of federations. Finally, and this is my last point, that although I've been talking about community forestry, if we think about conserving forests, we think about livelihoods and people dependent on them, then our long-term vision must go beyond that and beyond the local. A long-term vision must be a situation where you're less dependent on forests, where you have to not struggle in an everyday way for this, for which we need alternative fuels, we need alternative building materials, livelihoods, and we need national policies for energy and green economy. Now, one example of this is, for instance, improved stoves. Now, there's been a lot of push towards improved stoves. Here's an example of an improved stove. That's also not enough, because what you need is clean fuel. Improved stoves will still use firewood, and it can still have negative effects on health. And biogas is one example. It's my favorite example, but people here could come up with other alternative fuels, because I feel it's the most feasible. Okay, and lessons beyond green governance. Can we talk about institutions beyond, say, community forestry or water users associations, other institutions? I believe that my results could at least provoke people to look at some of these issues. One is critical mass. Does it matter? Does it have an impact in decision making? Does it have an impact in effective participation beyond the issue of equity? Does the 25 to 33%, where I find the critical mass lies in the institutions I've studied, does it really constitute a critical mass in other institutions at other levels? Can we test whether inclusion of socially disadvantaged women produces more effective and different outcomes in other institutions like village councils and legislatures? There's a little bit of work by Esther Dufflow's group on a caste, of the women making a difference to location of village wells, for instance. But I think we can go to higher levels beyond village councils. We could test whether village councils and legislatures are more likely than men to link with communities and to monitor ground impact on of the policies they formulate. Okay, so finally, I might say that, and with Sheila in mind also, that no discussion on the environment can be complete without emphasizing that sustainable development needs a shift in our values so that we recognize environmental gain and not just economic gain as an essential part of human well-being, not as in conflict with other elements of well-being. Now, we know that many environmental movements were built precisely on this recognition. And so I want to remind us again of one of the folk songs and slogans of the 1970s Chipko movement, which precisely carried this message. Do not axe these oaks and pines, nurture them, protect them. From these trees, the streams get their water and the earth their green. Look how the rhododendron smiles in the forest. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bina, for that wonderful tour through forests and through women's participatory issues. We have a certain amount of time for questions and answers, but just to set the tone for making this a conversational occasion, let me throw out one question for a bit of clarification and then open it up to the rest of the room. So, in your earlier work, when you first started looking at gender, I remember one of the things that you pointed out was that changing governance structures doesn't necessarily have an equitable impact on gender. And when people went to joint forest management, one of the things that they hadn't reckoned on was what management meant in micro terms. And the burdens of joint forest management, in a sense, fell, as I recall that work, disproportionately on women because they were the ones collecting the on-the-ground materials from the forest and so forth. So, in a way, it seems this talk seems to have come full cycle and is saying that, after all, you have to rethink over the governance structures in order to get the equality, whereas the previous tinkering with the governance structures had underlined the inequality in some sense. So, being in environmental studies, one thinks in terms of externalities, those things that people didn't notice and that are given value in order to be brought back into the discussion. I love the way you opened with the Tolkien story, because in my browsing through the book, that was a point that had struck me as well. What happens when these women enter the participatory framework? What would a microsociologist say about the kinds of things that are becoming visible. Is the labor that they're doing given greater value? I mean, so is a sort of sense of the housework of forest management becoming reincorporated into the economics of forestry? Or is it speaking in a different voice? I mean, say a little bit, if you would, about what the presence in the room actually accomplishes.
Right. Well, it's a complex question. I mean, but I'll simplify it for my ability to answer it. That what does it actually do beyond the fact that it has an impact on conservation? You'll say, fine. What does it do for the women themselves, for instance?
Or to the men.
Or to the men. Well, let's start with the women. You know, one of the things that I noticed, there's several things that are that need to be systematically looked at. But when I returned to some of these villages, not to all of them, it was very interesting that some of the women who'd been on the executive committee were now standing for elections in village councils. And these were scheduled caste women who were doing that. One of them had lost, and she sat with me and told her story. She said, well, you know, the scheduled caste was divided because they wanted to put up another woman. And I didn't get the support. Now, prior to this, that community, women were not coming forward for any kind of public office. So clearly, the very fact that they were part of this particular committee empowered them in some way to participate in further aspects of decision making in other institutions at the local level. Another thing which, it was actually a bit of a puzzle, which I started, and this is how I explained it. You know, in 1998-99, before I collected the systematic data for this study, I traveled across India and Nepal. And for 6 months, I traveled across 7 states. And I heard endless stories of women complaining that the forests were being managed by the men and they had no access to firewood. There were shortages of firewood and fodder. But at the same time, when I said I would like to see the forest, they were the ones who held my hand and led me to the forest. There was a great sense of pride. And when I reflected on this, I said there is some sort of paradox here, because they hate the idea of the forest being closed at some level because it's caused them hardship. At the same time, they're extremely proud of the fact that they have a community forest. And this is how I explained it, that these are women who actually had no land and no assets, but for the first time that they had the power of a commons to which they could say to the women in the next village, this is our forest, you cannot come in. So it created a sense of property rights, a sense of it, which they didn't have before. So although they didn't have private property, they had a commons. And perhaps you could explain this in other ways from your experience, but this is the way I thought is why they are so proud of it, that they can tell somebody else, this is ours. The impact on the men, it's interesting, you know, the men are okay with women's participating in a very functional way. So for instance, they'll say, oh yes, if we bring in more women, they are the ones who cut all the firewood, they destroy the forest. So if we bring in more women in the executive committee, maybe they will stop other women from cutting. That does happen, but the initial understanding that it is women who are actually doing most of the violations, I found was not the case. There's a chapter in the book on violations in which I ask men and women who actually breaks the rules, for what product, and is it an insider, is it an outsider, is it for timber, is it for firewood, etc. And overwhelmingly the response was that it's women who do it, much more than men. It's much more outsiders than insiders, meaning from outside the village. And then I contrasted this by asking them actual stories of violations. I said, okay, tell me, in how many cases have rules been broken? What happened? Who came? And in the story, they were not guarded. It wasn't their opinion. They were actually telling me. And when I extracted information from that, there was a big difference between the perception of violation, of who violated and who actually did. Because most of the violations tended to be by men for timber, and often from inside the village. So in a sense, what there's no straight answer in terms of the impact. But I think all forms of participation by women in decision making, including in the village council, is having a layered impact in the acceptance of women's presence in public space. And we see it, of course, much more consistently if you look at village councils and subsequent elections over time. So.
That's great, thank you. By the way, those of you who are sitting on the floor, there are some chairs over here if you want to quietly sort of crawl in front of the camera and go forward. You know, there's you can be more comfortable, and besides, we can see you, which is part of participation, and it might be nice from that point of view as well. Let me open up to questions from the floor. Could you just very quickly introduce yourself so Bina knows where you're coming from?
My most recent work has been on the village goddess in Orissa, and the village goddess is a tree, and I did field work there for about 5 years, and then the manuscript is now ready for publication. The forest, the goddess is a tree. These are for both, I extensively did work in the coastal area and with the tribals in the West. And there are different stories that they have to tell, but certainly the mythology of this, as well as a living mythology, the tree's presence and what the tree can do, and the conversations. They have conversations in what they call a dream with the tree, who they call Ma, and she has a name in each village that's different. But the conversations they consider are dialogues. The primary issues are regeneration of the crop, regeneration of the lineage. Those are their concerns. But she's a viable presence in their lives, and they envision her as an elderly woman who goes around the village at night to make sure the men aren't doing any mischief.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I found it, that patrol group, that picture I showed you. Again, it's very interesting when you're actually doing research. I remember sitting with that group, and they were doing the tree nursery, and an NGO, a male, had come with me in order to translate and so on. And then after a few minutes, they were answering in monosyllables every question I asked. He decided that he had some other work, so he disappeared. The moment he left, the women crowded around me. They took, this, and, they communicated. I don't know Gujarati, I know a little bit. So they pulled me to my feet, and they took me on a patrol. And they showed me that, look, this is what the men have missed.
That's been my experience also. When the man goes away, if he's in some quasi-official position, it's then that the women speak up.
It did surprise me, because I saw myself as an outsider in many ways. I'm coming from the city, etc. But still, they related with much more trust than I had expected.
There in the corner.
Hi, thanks. That was a great talk. I'm a graduate student in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department. I just had a quick question. Why did you just look at community forests in Gujarat as representative of India? And are you planning on extending this study elsewhere? And what impact do you think different state cultures would have on the outcomes?
That's very quick. The book is not based only on Gujarat. Remember, I traveled for 6 months across India, from the Western Ghats, from Karnataka, Orissa, Andhra, Gujarat, Uttarakhand, etc. But in order to do a systematic sample, you have to have a base. India doesn't collect data on the gender composition of groups. Gujarat had 3 NGOs which did have data on the gender composition of groups, which could give me some semblance of being able to do a stratified random sample. In Nepal, I was less constrained, because Nepal, the forest department collects data on the gender composition of groups across Nepal. So then I could first select the districts from which that would give me an adequate sample and then do it. So yes, it would be great if it could be done in other regions. I think we might find, I would particularly suggest doing something in a very, in a forest-rich and area with valuable timber, like Karnataka, if you had the database to test this out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's take clusters. Shall
Well,
I take
I'd
clusters?
call you by name, except I
Okay.
don't know who you are, so
I'm Rachel.
I have to point.
I'm a postdoc in the Sustainability Science program.
Yeah.
And you started to get at this when you mentioned the long-term sustainability. And I was wondering more broadly about the welfare outcomes from this reduced, I assume, reduced usage of forest products that resulted in increased conservation and increased forest canopy. So what were women actually substituting towards when they stopped extracting? And did you notice increased innovation and increased efficiency in the way they were using other sources? Or?
Yes. Right. Shall I take 2 or 3 questions at a time, or just answer one by one?
Well, we have a certain amount of
okay.
time. That's,
It was a painful story because there are 2 parts to the story. One is that they substituted inferior fuels. I mean, if you actually, it was very interesting. Women know the smoky trees from the non-smoky trees, and they were restricted to the smoky trees. So they substituted crop waste, particularly crop waste, and I have a lot of information in the book, in one of the chapters which deals with firewood and fodder on what they're substituting in a systematic way. And the better of households have trees, so they can use some of their own trees, but it's really the landless driftwood. They spend much more time collecting and so on. So there was no short-term solution. It was a story of hardship. But what did happen is that when you block off and prevent people from other villages from coming in, the actual amount of firewood that's available for you increases. The second is their constant negotiation within the committee wasn't to have open access, which would not have been sustainable. What it was, well, why are you opening only for 2 days? Let's open for 3 days. Let's open for twice the year, 2 times a year, 3 times a year. And often if they were on the committee, they were successful in allowing that extraction. So I actually did a regression on whether women's presence in the committee makes a difference to firewood shortages. And it does make a difference. That villages in which they have women on the committees were less likely to report firewood shortages. It's extremely difficult to measure shortages because increase in income also increases demand. But as you'll see, there are a range of ways by which I did that. The long-term solution has to lie in alternative fuels. Now, in 1986, I engaged with this idea, biofuels. I talk about that why is it that China has such a successful diffusion of stove programs. India and China started at exactly the same point, and India's program just didn't work. China's program has worked very well, both in biogas and in improved wood-burning stoves. And it has to do with their ability. It is part of a governance management thing from the top to the bottom. It's the decisions that have been made, adaptation of the requirements at the ground level, and involvement at all levels, from government to top initiative to the village level, is very well coordinated. As I said, I touch upon that in chapter 11 in the book, but it's worth looking at that because without that, you're not going to be able to succeed. Why do I say biogas? Because I don't think solar or wind, etc., is really an option at this point in time for very poor households. Biogas is a really feasible option. Yep.
Diana?
Thank you. Bina, for those of us who are not sort of involved very deeply in this area, the one thing we had heard about was the movement that started, I think, before the CFIs, and that is the Chipko movement,
Yes.
which you mentioned briefly. So what is the What's happened with that? Became so very famous and well-liked in the West. You know, let the axes fall first upon our backs kind of thing. But where is that now?
I haven't followed it through. I think there are lots of things that have happened in Uttarakhand which have overwhelmed the initiatives in the movement. I mean, what we've seen. I'm not talking as somebody who's actually revisited it in recent years, but if you see the Tehri Dam, all the sorts of initiatives, I think the macro processes and the have actually overwhelmed the kinds of messages which were being promoted and the sorts of initiatives which were being taken by the Chipko movement. So the impact of the movement was beyond. It was small in scale in some senses, but the impact was a very strong demonstration that communities are not predators, they are protectors. And many other movements, the Apiko movement and others, picked up from that. So it was a very important, as I see it, a very important part of the conversation which was taking place, the property rights, that who is the best protector? Is it the state? Is it private individuals? Is it communities? In pushing the argument that communities have a stake and could be important protectors, long before Ostrom wrote her book, for instance, it fed into that, I think, in a very powerful way.
I would like to make just one comment on that point only, because I've been to Uttarakhand.
Oh, great.
I'm from India, recently visiting now. Uttarakhand movement was basically caste-based, community-based, a particular community called Vaishnois. Anybody from India must be aware of that. They were involved in that. In 1970s, that movement was there. Yeah. And after that, what happened, that community dispersed along the border of Rajasthan and Haryana.
This is Bishnoi you're talking
about.
Bishnoi.
They were involved. They are in environment community in India, protection of the animals as well as the forest. And something like this community could not gather the momentum of this movement. So that's how
it's very interesting. And that was in the 70s that this began.
It was in 70s. If I'm not wrong, it is 73 onwards. It was in 70s that movement was in 70s. So it's just my little knowledge I shared.
But that's Bishnoi is different from the Chipko movement. But this is, yes, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. I'm actually from Uttarakhand. Okay. I was involved with Chipko movement for a long time. And my observations are basic. I just want to make 2 points. One is that I spend a lot of time in Uttarakhand, maybe 6-7 months every year traveling and involved with. So
talk a little bit louder,
my observations are basically the same, like in Uttarakhand. Like one of the blessing in disguise in Uttarakhand is it's a money order economy. So men are usually in the plains and women are in the mountains. So women generally run the whole economy there. Generally, so like two places, like you must have been to Anjani Sen and Munsiari, that we work there. And so there we experimented. So the forest came back actually with much more gusto than we had expected. And because these councils were 100% run by women, and they're like in these two areas, we also with biogas, we also have very successful solar program. So we were lucky enough to get subsidize that alternative energy and at relatively cheap. One of the policies Uttarakhand government initiated was that like especially in that area, you get very, very highly subsidized solar, solar cookers, as well as so at least in these two places working very well. So your observations about, I think, are pretty much relevant there. And one of the things that Chipko movement decided, that this was one of the decisions later on, that we need to have our own state. So the Chipko movement, morphed into a movement for a separate state, and for which we fought, and in 2000 we actually have a separate state now.
Right.
Yeah, so in that, Chipko movement was actually the base, and it was the women who led the struggle. But unfortunately, what has happened when the state was created, the power was given to traditional political parties. and who are all controlled by, muscle and money. Like this new chief minister 2 years ago when he was imposed by the center.
So we probably shouldn't displace the entire discussion into Indian politics writ large, which would keep us here. Let me take a couple of questions there. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about a bigger question about the reception of this work. You've been working on women for many years.
On gender,
wonderful contributions. I remember a meeting of the International Association of Feminist Economists when they reported a study to see how many of their contributions had been footnoted or referred to by mainstream economic publications and found it was very low. Do you find that your work is being picked up, or you seem to be in a gender ghetto?
Well, you tell me. I don't think so. I don't think it's. It seems to me that land rights. You can't talk about land rights today without talking about gender and land.
Yes.
It doesn't matter which forum you're talking about. So, so I don't think it's ghettoized. I don't think feminist work in general. I wrote a paper a while ago. It was a sort of mild paper. It wasn't a proper journal article. To ask, well, what makes a difference? To what extent has feminist economics impacted on mainstream economics? What features and what elements enable it? And here's what I came up with a typology, that if it actually challenges mainstream theory, if it is empirically verifiable, and if it has policy implications, you'll find that it has huge impact in mainstream. And as you go down the scale, it doesn't. So which are the two areas which have had huge impact? One is in questioning, in shifting from unitary to the bargaining model of the household. The idea that, preferences and everything are shared. Now, there's been a huge shift across mainstream economics, in which many of us have contributed. And the basis of that questioning has been the empirical part, that you can't make assumptions of unified preferences, objective functions, and so on, that men and women don't necessarily have the same interests, the same preferences, the same, etc. The second is labor economics. It's not possible to do labor economics without gendering the analysis. I think it has had some impact in agricultural economics, including the stuff as I talked on land. But when you pitch your arguments, this is interesting, when you pitch your arguments on ethical pegs, you find that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, and this is also some part of my debate with feminist scholars. They say, well, Bina, why do you bother with all these efficiency arguments? I said, nobody's going to listen to you unless you also show them that it's not only good for equity, it also is more productive, and it leads to better conservation outcomes. If you can show it empirically, people will read the stuff.
Yeah. Now, this book is out fairly recently, but do you have any evidence of it being picked up?
Well, the person who wrote The Population Bomb, Paul Eric, he's been citing it, among others. Yes, there's a group in Santa Barbara. I got an email 2 days ago. They've actually set up a core group called Gender and Conservation based on the book. They say they want to look at it globally. Does it make a difference? Right. So, I get little bits of feedback here and there. Yeah. So we'll see.
I think Bina's own career is a little bit of testament that it's not going totally unheard. Marty?
Yes, hi, Bina. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask whether you did any cross-analysis by women and men in those councils, by caste, by whether they were landless and whether they're migrants, because you had landless and migrants as a variable on the community level, but not at the EC level. And because there's a part of me that, and because I did some work in the 80s on this, that there are whole communities that want to conserve, not just the women in them. And so is there anything that we can say about the composition of the committees in terms of how many men are from the socially disadvantaged groups? Because you ended with socially disadvantaged women, and I just wonder how much class caste analysis has been done and could be done.
No, it's both, and the answer is complex. In the Gujarat exam case, the 80% and more are all scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, not scheduled caste. They're mainly tribal because that's where the forests have been. So you can't actually test it out. In the case of Nepal, I did. So I looked at, for instance, Brahmin particularly. The other groups are relatively, they're ethnic communities. They may be diverse in terms of their ethnicity, but not necessarily in terms of their class or social norms. And whether you belong to Brahmins or not in the executive committee makes a difference. The question of disadvantage, I found it's very interesting that landless men don't necessarily speak up. Landless women do. And so in one of the regressions which are in the book, I can share that with you later, the inclusion of landlessness in the village, for instance, has a negative effect on conservation. The larger the proportion of landless households, larger proportion of migrant households, there's a negative effect on conservation. But a larger proportion of landless women in the executive committee has a positive effect. Now, I got some insight on this in my field travels. So, for instance, in Orissa, I remember attending a meeting. I first talked to the women. It was getting late, and I talked to the women first. They had not been invited to the meeting. And then I attended this meeting. It was under a tree, and the entire it was entirely male, almost entirely male. And the low caste men was sitting on one side, and they were not intervening. The women had already told me that our men will go to the meeting and they will not say a word. Whereas if we went, we would speak up. So I think there is a difference. And Gillian Hart, if you remember in her comments on her study in Malaysia, talks about it, that men tend to identify and want to keep up with the ideas of masculinity of upper caste men. The women are outside that, so they tend to speak up more. Now, how far one can generalize on this, I can't say, but I do think there is some truth in this, perhaps.
And when they speak up, are they heard?
In this, if they are in sufficient numbers. So that's why in the PANCHMAHAL case, if there are sufficient numbers, they are heard.
And they reinforce each other?
You need more ethnographic work to see that. But typically, they don't contradict each other. Because on this count, they all want more firewood from the forest, basically. So they speak in one voice. Yeah.
Yes.
I found in the coastal villages, and this was not a systematic study because this wasn't what I was really looking for, but the women in the household made decisions on what crop to plant. In other words, if there were choices, they influenced that, or at least that was something they felt they could talk about and speak up about.
Just one point on Marty's question
sorry,
that yes, sorry.
No, I didn't mean finish with Marty first.
No, I just the starting point is that when communities are protecting men or women, it improves the forest. So both men and women have a stake in improving it. This is my starting position. And then does women's entry make a significant difference in addition to that? So that's the story.
Yes.
My name is Hadi. What impact does liberalization have on the forest and what's happening with that?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of conflict. I mean, there's conflict over mining rights. There's I think the story at the moment is that we haven't resolved that. At the level of the government, for instance, there are decisions taken. Do you allow mining, which is rich resources under the ground, but there are rich forests above. There are tribal communities which are dependent on those forests. Those are the conflicts that are being played out politically. I don't think there's an easy answer. Yeah.
We probably have time for one last question. Yes, Alicia?
I just came back from Bihar, where I was working mostly with women farmer groups. And one thing that they told me consistently is, as after they came together, and especially had success in increasing yields from adapting a technology, that had impacts looping back around on other parts of their community, and they had become more empowered in decisions about school for their children, and several other sets of important decisions. Is this something you also found? Were there other impacts on the women apart from just better forest management?
In this work, I didn't look at that. It was, but in my current work, which is more on farming and cooperation in farming, I am looking at that. Yeah, but I think those external impacts of group formation, I think, go beyond whether you're talking about forests or you're talking about anything else. You take self-help groups, you'll find similar impacts. It has more to do with collective strength and bargaining power and so on, then I would imagine. Shall we take one more from the young man standing there?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm a landscape architecture student, and it was particularly interesting the gendered practices that you brought up, because you showed women gathering firewood, doing mushroom hunting, other practices as well. In the United States, I feel like these practices are marginalized to the extent of like extermination, and that may have something to do with like large infrastructure for fuel, particularly. Do you think that the management of fuel resources, especially like fossil fuels, and even solar panels in India, as things continue to move towards that direction in some places, do you think that would marginalize these women's groups, or how do you think those? Are they antithetical?
I am not sold on the idea that we must have women's groups as the only way forward. It seems to me that if women are empowered and then they can function in mixed groups or general groups, that would be fine. The purpose is not to preserve the groups. The purpose is does the existence of those groups enable you to improve human well-being. So that would, that would be my position. There are many paths to empowerment.
Well, I think another way to understand the question, though, is if the entire kind of activity you're looking at is stratified down to a more marginal position, then will the question of gender still be significant, or is it that the rise in the overall level of wealth and the switch to other energy sources will just relegate this to such a marginal position that the governance gains may get lost? I mean, I don't know. It's a sort of, will the rising tide lift all boats, or will it leave some 10% sort of in the bottom, whatever it is? And is that the sort of thing you were trying to get at?
Yeah, because it seems like these roles are actually, I mean, just thinking, I'm an American, thinking of this position here, are even more marginalized now. So, I mean, some of the feminist discourse here would be, okay, how can we get women in positions of power which were previously held by men, while it seems like here you've really presented a strong alternative where these traditional roles are still really powerful in having an active change in village life and community life.
Well, I think questions of gender differences are not going to disappear anytime. It seems to me that conceptually one can broaden it to see how do disadvantaged groups get empowered, by what institutions and by what structures. Technology comes into it, but I don't think technological inputs alone are going to change the balance in itself. So yes, the need for voice and choice and empowerment will remain in terms of even access to all sorts of technologies. I think it's worth looking at in the United States. I mean, there are differences, racial and class and other differences exist in the United States as well. And so there is some relevance despite a very different level of technology that you're dealing with, that those differences are still playing out. So there would be a role. I mean, if you take communities, townships, I mean, Jane Mansbridge has worked on it, and others have worked on it, that it's still important in the United States as well, and in your legislatures, as well. You have rather small proportion of women.
I think those reminders that the problems are not just all located in this strange region called South Asia. That's very important.
Yeah.
Bina dedicates this book to her mother, whom she calls an indomitable spirit. So I think Bina has shown that something about genetic transmission has worked in this case. So please join me in thanking her for a wonderful presentation.
I wish I'd heard more from you.
Next time.
Next time, yeah.